Hello, it's The Week in Art. I'm Ben Luke. This week, Just Stop Oil's Stonehenge protest, Tavares Strachan in London, and Louise Bourgeois at the Galleria Borghese. On Wednesday, two activists from the group Just Stop Oil sprayed orange powder paint made from cornflour onto three of the boulders at Stonehenge, prompting outrage and some support. Before this latest action, in an article for the next print edition of the art newspaper, Paul Stonard had argued that Just Stop Oil's museum-based protests add up to one of the most successful campaigns of civil disobedience in history. He joins me to reflect on whether the latest protests reinforce this conviction. At the Hayward Gallery in London, the Bahamian-born US-based artist Tavares Strachan has just opened his first major survey exhibition. I went to the gallery to talk to him. And this episode's Work of the Week is Janus Fleuri by Louise Bourgeois, made in 1968. It's one of the highlights of Unconscious Memories, a show in which Bourgeois' sculptures and installations are featured alongside the historic works in the Galleria Borghese in Rome. I speak to Cloé Perrone, the co-curator of the exhibition. Before all that, our latest subscription offer, a free 8-week trial of a digital subscription to the art newspaper. Visit theartnewspaper.com to find out more. And do also subscribe to this podcast and our sister podcast, A Brush With, wherever you're listening. The latest episode of A Brush With features a conversation with Ikshan Adams. Please also give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. Now, Stonehenge was the latest target for the protests of the environmental activist group Just Stop Oil. In what they called megalithic action, timed to coincide with the summer solstice on Friday, where crowds flocked to the ancient stones, the action involved two protesters spraying the 4,500-year-old boulders with orange powder paint made from cornflour. Just Stop Oil is demanding that the next government, which they're presuming will be a Labour administration because the party's around 20 points ahead in most opinion polls, signs up to a legally binding treaty to phase out fossil fuels by 2030. The Stonehenge site was initially closed and the paint was removed by English Heritage, the organisation responsible for the site. They confirmed that no damage was done to the stones themselves or to the lichen growing on them. But the action drew strong condemnation from British politicians, including the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and the Labour leader Keir Starmer, and prompted some outrage on social media. It also drew support from some commentators. Coincidentally, the art historian Paul Stonard has written a column due to be published in the July-August issue of the art newspaper, in which he analyses Just Stop Oil's protests in museums and galleries and declares that they have undoubtedly been one of the most successful campaigns of civil disobedience in history. But do the events at Stonehenge reinforce or undermine his assertion? I spoke to Paul to find out. Paul, we're talking the morning after Stonehenge has just been attacked by Just Stop Oil. What did you make of the action, and did it in a way support your thesis?
I think my initial response to it was my heart dropped, and it did make me wonder, I have to say, because it seemed to be an action that was stepping even beyond what Just Stop Oil have done in the past. So my heart did drop, and I had what I have to every one of these actions, which is a very strong emotional response. The first thing you think is, oh no, not again, they haven't done that, have they?
Yeah.
But I think this is very important, this emotional response, and it's entirely the point of the actions, is to elicit this very strong emotional response, which leaves you with a question: why are we not having this emotional response to the climate catastrophe? So the very fact that it did make me question my thesis was, I think, also a reinforcement of that thesis.
Absolutely. And that's very true, isn't it? That a lot of the commentary around this from environmental groups is, why is it that such extreme reactions are reserved for attacks on artworks rather than the wider theme, the wider point that is being made by Just Stop Oil, which is the relentless missing of targets and the apparent apathy of governments and corporations in relation to the climate catastrophe?
Yeah, I mean, that's very well put. And the focus on the effects, the damage, supposed damage, and of course we heard this morning there was no damage at all to Stonehenge, is part of the narrative, part of the reaction to these actions, and it's the emotional reaction. And our initial response is the spectacle, the vision of something, a work of art besmirched. It's entirely natural and entirely understandable that we would focus initially on the effects. But the point of these actions, it's about what happens afterwards, and it's about the way in which a question is being forced into the public mind and the way in which we are obliged to reflect on it, obliged to take a position on what is happening, this unfolding catastrophe of climate change. The important thing is here that these actions aren't meant to be liked or to gain popularity. That's obviously not the case. And so for those who say, well, they've done it now, I can't support them anymore, you've missed the point. The point is absolutely to force the question into the public mind in a sphere where it's otherwise being largely ignored, and I think increasingly ignored as climate impacts intensify.
One of the things that Just Stop Oil have just relentlessly said, and indeed said on this podcast when they came on to talk to us, is that they're not courting public opinion. They're not trying to please people by doing this. They're trying to get people up and active. They're trying to make people respond. And also they're aiming for a percentage of those people seeing it and going, well, hang on, they've got a point, right? So this isn't about being liked. Just Stop Oil do not care whether people like them.
If it was a campaign to gain popularity, it would be an epic failure. The remarkable thing about the action yesterday is that by, I think, 6 o'clock, it had 6 million views on Twitter. It had been commented on by all political leaders, or at least Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak, and had been reported in national newspapers. I mean, that's reach. And if reach is a guide to success of your campaign, putting a message across, it was a fantastically successful action. I totally understand the fact of how upsetting it was to English heritage and all those who work at Stonehenge. Of course it is, like the museum and gallery actions. But you're not going to have that reach if you don't operate within a certain margin, as it were, of risk. And it was a real relief to find out there was no damage done this morning.
Yeah, and it's been amusing to see how many lichen experts suddenly appear out of the woodwork on Twitter. There are suddenly thousands of people who suddenly know a lot about lichen.
I mean, the nation's attention was focused on the lichen on Stonehenge all yesterday afternoon. It was a wonderful moment of coming together,
Indeed, and there was actually something really touching about how much affection out there is for Stonehenge, how many people see it as a historic monument. But it rather reinforced the point that Just Stop Oil makes, that they do this because people have the affection for things like Stonehenge and for Van Gogh's sunflowers and so on, that by targeting these particular items of cultural interest, they know they are going to get that cut through that you just talked about on social media and so on.
These are the things we love and these are the things we're going to lose. And it wouldn't make sense if there wasn't a value attached to the object you were targeting. The attacks are routinely described as vandalism and damage. I would say that there has been no significant, if any, damage done to any work of art targeted in a direct action. And this is not a matter of chance at all. It's clear that the actions are thought out, they're planned, and they're executed in a way which is designed not to damage works of art at all. You don't damage a work of art if you put something on the frame. There are, of course, with the Rokeby Venus, which had its glass smashed, that was pushed. And again, as with Stonehenge yesterday, it made my heart drop. And it was good to hear that there was no significant damage. I think there was surface abrasion to the canvas itself.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that in a way was the example which it really did push the envelope, as it were, and it did make a lot of us consider what we felt about it, even if we had kind of got Just Stop Oil's point in the past, because it was a hammer attack on the glass, which meant that there was some minor surface damage, which was very quickly cleared up, but it was off view, that painting, for a considerably longer period than, for instance, Stonehenge was closed off for yesterday. So I suppose the question with that particular incident was, there will be copycat incidents, as we have seen. Just Stop Oil might be taking great care not to damage the actual fabric of the artworks and the monuments, but that doesn't mean that everybody is going to treat it in the same way, and therefore there may be a moment where we do have lasting damage. And I guess the question is it actually worth it?
Yes, that's certainly a good question. The Rokeby Venus action was so carefully planned that they knew exactly where they would hit on the glass, how many times, and with what degree of pressure. Still, there was this risk involved. And as I said, without risk, you're not going to have impact. You won't be able to get your message across. And I think activists are very well aware that if any damage is actually done to a work of art, if a work of art is destroyed, it totally undermines their cause. But it's not something that we have to look to the future for. I don't know if you remember, in 1987, someone went into the National Gallery with a shotgun and shot the Leonardo cartoon. And there have been many other examples of actual vandalism.
Yes, exactly, the suffragette attack on that very same painting. On
with
the
a
Rokeby Venus,
with a meat cleaver, which is a slightly different thing to a safety hammer. I think your point is absolutely right, and it's something we have to be worried and concerned about. I thought that the slashing of the portrait of Lord Balfour was a terribly misguided and negative action and did nothing for the cause whatsoever. But I also understand the emotion and anger and passion from which that action came. You can't stop people doing these things. You can, of course, try and prevent it. You can have more security. You might want to even address the reason why they're doing these actions in the first place. But the point is that museums are public places, and there are places where meaningful things happen. And in a way, we should be, in some respects, glad that we have the possibility to have these spaces where such actions can be conducted. You couldn't do this in China. People say, go and protest in China. You can't do this in China. You couldn't do this in Russia.
Right. That's very true. I wanted to explore the idea of it being a success a bit more. At the time of the attack on Van Gogh's Sunflowers, that campaign was very much about new oil and gas licences being issued by the UK government. It seems to me it had absolutely no effect on the Conservative Party's policies in relation to oil and gas. We may well get a change to that policy because we have a change of government on the 4th of July. But it seems to me that on those terms, the Just Stop Oil action was not a success in the sense that it didn't move the dial one bit on that particular issue. So therefore, can it be regarded as a success?
Well, yes, I think it can, as I said, through the degree to which it put that question at the forefront of the public mind at a time when there's what has been described as a mass delusion of normalcy. We're carrying on as normal, as though the world isn't ending. It is. And the point being made is we can't carry on as normal. And it's really a matter for each of us, all of our individual consciences, to act. We all have a sort of individual duty. When we see that political leaders are doing nothing, and the polluters are certainly doing nothing, issuing more licenses, 82 oil and gas licenses were issued in the latest round earlier this year, which is astonishing considering the desperate advice being given by climate scientists around the world. I'm not sure that Just Stop Oil ever really expected the Conservative government to reverse their policy. I think they were making a very strong and valid point, which wasn't being really made anywhere else. I'm not sure also that you could really ascribe the Labour government's policy to Just Stop Oil, and they are doing all they can to distance themselves from this. Keir Starmer's tweet yesterday about the terrible damage these pathetic people was clearly politically motivated. Nobody wants to be associated with Just Stop Oil, really. And there's another point there, which is speaking out. I think a lot of people feel very concerned about expressing any degree of support for climate activism, particularly such radical climate activism, for fear of professional repercussions. I'm fortunate in the sense that I'm freelance. I can ruin my career for myself, as it were. I don't have anyone looking over my shoulder. But a lot of people I've spoken to in museums say they entirely agree with the mission and they understand the tactics, but they can't speak out in public about it. I think this is changing.
Right. But
this has been the case so far. I think climate activism also in the past has demonstrably had an effect on political discourse. If you remember, in 2019, Extinction Rebellion met with Michael Gove, and they said it was marginally less shit than they thought it would be. And after that, as I seem to remember, the government declared a climate emergency. Activism absolutely works, and the declaration of climate emergency by so many cultural organisations, including Tate, after the pressure put on by Liberate Tate, is a definite result and a success.
Right. The political response that you just hinted at there when you talked about Keir Starmer's response, it seems pretty universally condemnatory and quite extreme in some ways, it seems to me. You know, Starmer used the term the full force of the law. We know that Phoebe Plummer and Anna Holland, who were the two women who attacked the Sunflowers, are going to court in July, for instance. The French culture minister described the people that attacked a Monet at the Musée d'Orsay recently as delinquents. Do you think that the politicians are slightly getting this wrong, are pandering to particular sections of the media and the public? And in the sense that I think if you even spend a little cursory amount of time looking at comments on social media, they are missing a whole section of the population that actually does seem to recognise this for what it is and seem to be recognising that Just Stop Oil are taking care to a certain degree. So I think it seems to me that a lot of the politicians are going very much on the authoritarian bent rather than really considering what the wider public opinion might be.
Yeah, I've had very much the same thought. The loudest voices are always the negative ones and give a distorted sense of the degree of public opinion. Nobody nowadays is really going to deny that the climate emergency is the greatest problem we face. It is a real existential threat. Last year was the hottest year on record. I mean, you can go through the statistics. In a sense, we get through our days by trying to ignore that. But it's there and it's true. And I think, as you say, this very personal shaming response to activists is something that's increasingly baffling me for the reasons you've just said. Everyone is aware of the situation. Everyone now can see that these actions are not causing actual damage. They may appear like desecrations, as Stonehenge was yesterday, or they may appear to be attacking cultural values. But the lasting effect is not the damage itself. I went to the National Gallery the day after Phoebe and Anna threw soup on the painting. The painting was back up, the gallery was full, twice as many people looking at it. It had become a sort of celebrity for the day. That's the actual result when it comes to the works of art. But I totally agree that this sort of ad hominem, this shaming, it's like the first response you have when you can't deal with a message. You pathologise the messenger.
I wanted to talk about costs to museums, because one of the things is that we know that the people who look after Stonehenge went out and used air blowers to clean the stones. There would have been a cost related to that, of course. People are now being employed for greater security in museums. We've heard directly from Gabriele Finaldi, the director of the National Gallery, that literally hundreds of paintings in the National Gallery have been glazed as a result of these attacks. Hundreds of paintings being glazed, again, is going to cost a lot of money. Museums are cash-strapped. Cultural and heritage organisations are not bathing in cash. Isn't this a factor in all of this, that actually we should be thinking about cultural workers and we should be thinking about cultural institutions as things to be supported and not undermined in the response to the climate emergency?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it must be immensely upsetting to have something like this happen to a work of art that you spend your life preserving, caring for, and making sure it can be seen in the best possible circumstances. It feels like a personal attack in the same way that attacks on works of art are seen as attacks on living things. I would have said to Gabriele, if you look at the pattern, these attacks only happen on glazed works. So by glazing all these works, you're essentially creating more targets. Just Stop Oil would never attack an unglazed painting. Right. It would be a ridiculous thing to do. But the question of costs is, of course, important. The simple answer is, well, these costs are real and they're a consideration. They're not a reason to do something which is avoiding a far greater cost further down the line, actually coming much closer than we think.
Lastly, before the Stonehenge attacks happened, and when we were due to talk about this anyway, I wrote a question down, which was, do you expect the attacks will continue or will they inevitably lose their impact? I think the Stonehenge attack reinforces the fact that it's certainly not going to be going away for the imminent future, even if it in subsequent years might lose its impact.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, Just Stop Oil are part of a much wider international network of climate activists, and they're working in many different ways. I mean, when you're looking at the sort of radical flank, you mustn't forget the degree of, for example, climate litigation, which is going on. Only this morning, the Supreme Court in this country declared that drilling for oil in Surrey was illegal. It doesn't conform to the government's pledges on carbon emissions. The climate litigation is incredibly important. All these things act together as part of a broad front, as it were, of climate activism. The news this morning that in Stansted Airport, 2 activists put a lot of yellow paint on private jets. It was an absolutely brilliant strategy to have the attack on Stonehenge yesterday and the attack on the private jets this morning, which caused real damage. Where is the outrage against that damage? Where is the outrage against the catastrophic climate breakdown that we're experiencing?
So it's a kind of pincer movement, you mean?
Totally a pincer movement, and I'd say a sort of brilliant strategy, if that's one way of putting it. I do think it's true that the effects of repeating a similar action, for example, actions in museums, is obviously going to eventually not register in the public mind. The impact is going to diminish. And as far as I'm aware, Just Stop Oil have stopped direct museum actions, as they've told me, for the time being. But of course, they can't say what's going to happen in the future. The really important thing with cultural disruption is that it's continuous. You can't do a little bit and then stop. It won't have any effect. It has to be a continuous thing. The climate emergency is not stopping. The climate emergency doesn't care about this at all. But you have to keep on going in the hope that you will not only keep the message at the forefront of the public mind where it should be, but that will eventually lead to political leaders making the changes that absolutely need to be made at this moment.
And in fact, those political leaders' reactions in their extremity and how forthright they are helps propel it, doesn't it?
Yes, I mean, they're falling right into the trap. I mean, there's a sensational aspect to it, which I sort of dare say a lot of people rather enjoy.
You mean the political leaders rather enjoy?
Well, the political leaders rather enjoy because it's a chance to make a statement, it's a chance to solidify your position. It's a chance, you imagine, to get a lot of people on your side. As you suggested, that might not be quite the case. For example, the Animal Rising action on the Jonathan Yeo portrait, which was, again, the response was, throw them in prison, this vandalism, this damage of this painting. They put 2 stickers on the glazing, which were up for about 20 seconds. And again, an hour later, I went down to see the painting. It was like nothing had happened.
And Philip Mould was very grateful for the attention.
Exactly. So this is entirely the point. I'm not saying in any way that he was complicit in this action at all. But you might start wondering, why they're not targeting us? Are we not valuable enough? Are we not culturally significant enough? I think the response of museums has been pretty exemplary. The National Gallery putting the Van Gogh on view the next day with actually minimal security and, in a way, not making any fuss about it, I think was sort of the right response. ICOM, which is a question you did mention, they made a statement in November 2022, which was, in some senses, the most forthright, truthful and clear-minded description of the importance of climate activism in museum alongside the important role that museums play in, as they put it, being a climate ally for influencing climate policy. So I think in both cases, I think there's actually room for collaboration. If we're talking about what's going to happen to these attacks or what's going to happen to this program of cultural disruption, I would hope that museums might actually incorporate the emotion, the idea, into what they're doing. They can't do it now, of course, and I know that the Rokeby attackers and, of course, Phoebe and Anna have been banned from the National Gallery. And, of course, when it comes to the exemplary role of museums, I'm afraid the British Museum is a pariah in that sense because of its renewed sponsorship deal with BP, which I think increasingly will make it incredibly difficult for them to find any sort of moral legitimacy in any statements about climate, which is remarkable for a museum which has as its core goal the preservation of world culture.
Well, John Paul, thank you so much.
Thank you.
You can read John Paul's article on Just Stop Oil's protests in the Art Newspaper's July-August print edition, which is out on the 1st of July, online at theartnewspaper.com or on the app. Coming up, Tavares Strachan at the Hayward Gallery and Louise Bourgeois at the Galleria Borghese. But first, here's this week's news bulletin. The Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has called on Pope Francis to follow through on promises to return cultural objects from the Vatican to First Nations communities in Canada after a meeting last week. Trudeau had an audience with the pontiff during the G7 meeting in Italy on the 14th of June, after which he created social media posts in which he thanked him for taking up the work of reconciliation but advocated returning cultural artefacts to Indigenous peoples. The full extent of the Vatican's collection of Indigenous items is not known, but during a press conference in the spring of 2023, the Pope said that the restitution of Canadian Indigenous objects was, quote, going on. But Trudeau's posts echoed the findings of an investigation published by the Globe and Mail newspaper in Canada in March that found that, despite those previous public commitments, minimal progress has occurred. Barbara Gladstone, a powerful dealer since the 1980s in the New York art market and beyond, has died aged 89. A spokesperson for her gallery confirmed that she died in Paris on the 16th of June following a brief illness. Gladstone came to the business of contemporary art when she was in her 40s, abandoning a job teaching art history at Hofstra University on Long Island in 1980 to open a small gallery in Manhattan. The business has grown to operate 2 vast complexes in Chelsea and a space on the Upper East Side, as well as galleries in Brussels, house and soul, and an office in Los Angeles. Among the more than 70 artists and artist estates in the gallery's roster are Keith Haring, Robert Mapplethorpe, Shirin Neshat and Carrie Mae Weems. Following her death, the gallery will continue to be run by a 4-person leadership team made up of Gavin Brown, who closed his gallery to join Gladstone in 2020, bringing his own prestigious roster of artists, as well as Max Falkenstein, Caroline Luce and Paula Tsai. They said in a statement that Gladstone had been preparing for this day and set her leadership transition plans in motion in 2016, when Falkenstein became a co-owner of the gallery. James Purnell has resigned as President and Vice-Chancellor of the University of the Arts London, or UAL, following months-long student protests against the university's stance on the war in Gaza and calls for his resignation. In a statement posted on UAL's website yesterday, the university announced that Purnell would be leaving his post in September to become the Chief Executive at Flint Global, a consultancy offering policy and regulatory advice. Karen Stanton, who serves on UAL's Board of Governors and is currently Interim Vice-Chancellor at Bishop Gloucester University, will take over as interim president and vice-chancellor. In a statement, Purnell described UAL as a unique, brilliant institution, but made no direct comment on the protests. A statement by UAL Students for Justice in Palestine said that the group was delighted and energised by the news of James Purnell's resignation. Referring to Purnell's political history and voting record on issues such as the Iraq War, the statement added, "Anyone like that has no place leading an academic institution." The group confirmed that the protest would not end with Purnell's departure. Purnell, who joined UAL in 2021, is a former Member of Parliament and BBC executive and was the chair of Labour Friends of Israel between 2002 and 2004. You can read all these stories and much more on the website or the app. Now, the Hayward Gallery in London has just opened a survey of the work of the Bahamian-born, New York-based artist Tavares Strachan. It includes works in a variety of media, including painting, sculpture, installation, neon, and sound.
That is what darkness is for.
To know that in oneself.
Waiting to be found.
Waiting to be found.
There is a light.
There is a light.
That's the quote from the writer James Baldwin that's also emblazoned in neon on one of the walls of the exhibition and lends the show its title, There is Light Somewhere. Strachan's art appears across the Hayward's 2 floors, on its terraces and on the side of the building, and seeks to unearth hidden histories and to tell lost stories of individuals and diverse African diasporic cultures. So the exhibition features references to figures who are relatively unknown to most of us, like the first African-American astronaut, Robert Henry Lawrence, and Matthew Henson, the African-American explorer who was the first man to reach the North Pole, before Robert Peary, who Henson accompanied on the exhibition, yet took sole credit. It also includes one of Strachan's most ambitious projects, the creation of a 2,500-page book, The Encyclopedia of Invisibility, which lays out in complex detail the individuals, events and ideas he feels have been overlooked. I went to the Hayward to meet him. Tavares, there's a quote that's in one of the wall texts here about how leaving the island of the Bahamas is a kind of metaphor, but also a physical reality. When you see a big retrospective of this kind, how do you measure the effectiveness of leaving the island, as it were? Is it a real sort of exploratory process looking into yourself in this way?
Yeah, first off, it's more of a takeover than it is a retrospective, in the sense that I'm mostly looking forward, not backward. And in terms of the island as metaphor, as we stand on an island, I think islands are great places for contemplation, and I think a huge part of how you understand them is by being on them, but also being off of them and looking at them from afar.
And there's a very nice island moment, if you like, in the show where you have the Black Star Line on the terrace upstairs, one of the many references to Marcus Garvey in this exhibition. So you actually literally have this pool and a replica of the boat, and out from that is pumping reggae music.
Right.
Tell us more about that, because that seems to me a very deliberate decision to look from an island nation and a colonial nation across to Africa.
I think what's inspiring about the Black Star Line project and the shipping company and Marcus Garvey and that whole story is how he has inspired so much of the creative class in the Caribbean, whether it's through clothing or through music or through a more profound understanding of sense of self. For a lot of us, I think the displacement of being in the diaspora is something that we're still working out. And he's, in a way, a kind of star, as a kind of guide to help us reposition ourselves. And I think understanding his ideology that was based on the freedom of movement of people forces you to not just be limited to an island.
And of course, he's like emblematically outside the exhibition, right,
He is,
as well.
yeah.
So in one of these sculptures where you have this evocation of a kind of ancient sculpture which appears to be cracked and appears to be in some form of entropy, but at the same time they're made from bronze, so there's a sort of double-edged element to it. There's a sort of they're here forever, they have ancient links, so on. There's all sorts of lovely kind of metaphors even within that sculpture, I think.
Yeah, I think bronze as a material, it really represents the consciousness of humanity, because I think that's linked to the idea that humanity tells you what it believes in through how it holds stories and passes on to the next generation, right? So what we teach to young people, what we teach the next generation, or what we teach the future is what we value in the moment, right? And bronze is good at holding it in terms of physical presence, but also in terms of the fact that when you look at a ruin, you understand something about that culture, that moment, 6,000 years ago, right? And so the idea is that when you look back on this moment, 5,000 years from now, perhaps you'll understand something a little bit about the importance of Marcus Garvey and what he did for a lot of people.
Right. And there's a curious relationship with time all the way through the show, it seems to me. So the work Intergalactic Palace upstairs, for instance, you have a contemporary turntable, you have historic sheet music, you have the timeless eternity of stars which flash throughout the structure. And also you have, an iron oxide floor which is evoking both East Africa and Mars. So it seems to me you're making all sorts of geographical and temporal leaps within that work. Tell me more about that.
As a student of Einstein, it doesn't travel in a straight line, right? It's not linear. So from a creative perspective, so much of how I understand processes are in a kind of timeless void, if you will, for lack of a better word. And it's a kind of composition in a way, right? Like if you think about a symphony, for me, the goal is to make a kind of visual music, but also literal sound and smell and a kind of orchestra of the senses. And that's kind of how I'm thinking about making things.
Right. It really feels like an orchestra of the senses, because I was really conscious as I was walking through, there's a kind of delay of sort of reverb happening as my footsteps hit that floor, and that relates to dub and so on. And it's like sound as a cultural entity, right?
Yeah, or also the smell of the starch and the rice that's in this room.
Yeah.
As we move into the future, I think we're redefining the terms of what an art experience is. And I think at the forefront of that is getting more in tune with the senses in a highly technological world that is screen-based and microwave-centric in terms of speed. So I think the senses are really keen for me.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a sort of element of tactility as well, it seems to me, and I love the materiality in this show. Right next to us here, we have this kind of ceramic totem, if you like, a kind of wonderful ceramic object which is surrounded by this rice grass that you were talking about. All the way through the show, it seems to me you're making all sorts of collisions of materials, and that seems important.
I think the way that the show's laid out is the way that life exists in a way, in the sense that one material is always leaning up against another material or abutting another material or overlapping. And I think for me, when I moved from the Bahamas to the States and I went to high-powered art schools, I think so much of it was focused on separating things. If you were a photographer, you were in one corner. If you were a painter, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it was interesting unlearning a lot of that, understanding the relationships that exist within the real world of materials, right?
Yeah.
And going back to that sensibility in a way.
Right. Learning and unlearning seem to me to be, they're in parallel to each other through the work. Learning is what so much of the work is about. By making it an encyclopedia, in a way you're talking about unlearning and relearning and so on. Tell us more about that aspect.
Yeah, I think when I began the Encyclopedia of Invisibility, 3,000 pages, 15 to 17,000 entries, I think a huge part of that process was about creating a place for things that didn't have a place, which I think this exhibition is really centered around, that idea of finding place for placelessness. And so it really was a thought experiment in a way. If the things that people were talking about lived somewhere, well, where were the things that people weren't going to be talking about? And that was the genesis of the encyclopedia.
And there's an interesting relationship, it seems to me, between very, very widely celebrated and renowned figures. So, for instance, in the encyclopedia works, you have images of Malcolm X, for instance, and Tutankhamun, and enormously celebrated figures to a certain degree.
Yeah.
But then you also very clearly want to draw out a familiarity with people like Matthew Henson, this explorer that very, very few people would know about.
Right.
So there's an interesting relationship between the different stratospheres of knowledge within particular people and also fields, it seems to me, of knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question's really simple. Who knows what another person knows and what they don't know, right? And I think the magic is always in the misunderstanding, right? And I think a huge part of the Colonial Project is about knowing. And I think for me, having a sense of positive uncertainty and a healthy sense of skepticism, I think, is really a critical part of how we move into the future.
Is there also a sense in which you're playing with the making of meaning? In the sense, so, for instance, with these images around us now, these totems that I mentioned earlier on, they, on the one hand, they have a contemporary image of a sporting entity, which is a soccer ball or an American football. Yeah. But at the same time, they have these important cultural figures. So you have Matthew Henson and Haile Selassie. But then at the same time, there are cultural objects from outside of the West and so on. So you're making meaning as well as referring to historic meaning and contemporary meaning and so on.
I think there's two things. I think one, can you tell me what the title of this one is? This one here.
Okay, it's called Jar Rastafari with rice fields stacked with pineapple, shield and football.
Good. I think when you say Jar Rastafari, it evokes for me a kind of power. And so for me, the power of this work is a relationship to a knowledge-based system that in a way was derived outside of the terms of the West, if you will. And when you say it, you channel Garvey, you channel Bunny Wailer, you channel Malcolm, you channel Dr. King, you channel all that energy. And I think these are all people with full lives who know about shields, who understand royalty, who play various sports, who understand the importance of the movement of people. And to me, there's a lot in that title.
That's interesting. So the relationship between words and image is really important in the work, generally.
Yeah. I think you manifest the world through the spoken word.
Yeah.
Right? You are what you tell yourself you are. So when you say the word, you join a long lineage of freedom fighters, knowledge purveyors, people who care deeply about what their communities are interested in, how they're ran, the cultural fabric, really. Right? You just partnered with history.
And lastly, therefore, the importance of that quote from James Baldwin, which you have in neon in a space near us here, seems to me to be doubly significant in the sense that it's not only there in light and it's about darkness and light, but it's also said and broken up into fragments, if you like, collages, which create new meanings from it. So tell us again about that.
I think one of the great luxuries of being an artist is that we don't really make meaning. I don't make meaning. You know, I always thought that once I became an artist, I abandoned the meaning-making business. And I think it's really up to the viewers to think through the relationships and to think through how the works are vibrating to them, what it's communicating to them. I didn't grow up feeling connected to or had a affinity towards going to galleries and museums. And I say that honestly. And so when I started thinking seriously about being an artist, I think a huge part of that process had to do with creating opportunities for empowerment of the audience, right? That the audience were equal players in the kind of chess match of the history, the present, and the future of art.
Tavares, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Tavares Strachan, There Is Light Somewhere, is at the Hayward Gallery in London until the 1st of September. And now it's time for the work of the week. The French-American artist Louise Bourgeois spent a pivotal period of her career in Italy in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and the works that she created in that period are among the key objects in a remarkable new exhibition which brings Bourgeois's work into the heart of one of the greatest of all Italy's museums, the Galleria Borghese in Rome. Among them is Janus Fleuri, made in 1968. The exhibition was conceived by Cloé Perrone, and I spoke to her about the sculpture. Cloé, before we talk about the specific work by Louise Bourgeois that we're going to talk about, let's talk about the fact that you're showing Louise Bourgeois in the Galleria Borghese. She visited the Borghese and very excitedly wrote to her husband about that experience, didn't she?
Yes, absolutely. So Louise Bourgeois came to Rome in 1967 and she visited the Galleria Borghese on November 8th. And on the same day, she wrote a letter to her husband, Robert Goldwater, who was an art historian, very well known. And she's enthusiastic about the city, about the museums. She describes her visit at Palazzo Barberini, at the Vatican museums. She explains that she couldn't find the church of Borromini that her husband advises her to visit. And finally, she arrives at the Galleria Borghese, where she visits both the villa and the park. And she's mesmerized by it. She writes about the Bernini, saying that she's so sick of it.
Yeah, exactly. 6!
Yes. And so this was our starting point. So this Italian trip that she'd made in 1967, that was very important. Also, it's the first time she travels on her own, without her family, without her husband or her kids. She suffered from a very long depression that started after her father passed away in 1953. And so this is kind of a rebirth for her. She arrives in Italy, she sets a studio in Pietrasanta, she meets other artists, and she starts a full body of new works.
That's amazing, isn't it? And it absolutely is transformative for her work, isn't it? In the sense that she begins working with materials that she up until that point had not really worked with. Obviously, some of them are loaded with the kind of history of Italian art and so on.
Yes, absolutely. She started using marble, and it's a new medium for her. She continues producing in bronze as well. And Pietrasanta at the time was a very creative and productive place, so I'm sure she could find lots of new ideas.
I wanted to also explore this fact that she had been a gallery assistant, a docent at the Musée du Louvre in Paris in the 1930s, where she had actually come across the Borghese collection that was no longer in Rome, but had travelled under Napoleon to Paris, was taken to Paris, and now is absolutely central to the Louvre's collection. And of course, she would have seen things like Bernini's Sleeping Aphrodite, or rather the Sleeping Aphrodite that was given a mattress by Bernini in that collection. And that would have meant a tremendous amount to her.
Yes, absolutely. That was, to me, a very interesting point, because basically she meets the collection before seeing the villa and the gardens, which happens much later, because that happens in 1967. She traveled in her 20s, but she actually never came to Italy before 1967. But she knew the collection of Scipione Borghese really well, because Camillo Borghese sold it to Napoleon in 1808, and since then it has been exhibited at the Louvre. And first she studied there at the famous École du Louvre. That was one of the places where you had to study. And also she also studied with various other artists at what were called the Académie in Paris, and also with Fernand Léger, with whom I believe she became friends somehow, because he advised her at a certain point to stop drawing and painting and actually move to sculpture. He's the first one who sees that in her work. And then she became a docent as well, and so she was giving guided tours at the Louvre. So she must knew the collection really well.
Yeah, that's really striking, isn't it? And then in terms of her response to the art of the past, I know in the catalogue, Jerry Gorovoy, in an interview, who worked very closely with Louise Bourgeois for many years at the end of her life, he's very clear to point out that she doesn't sort of directly refer to the history of art very much, does she? She's quite careful about her response to influences, as it were. But she did actually make, I mean, this isn't not the work we're going to be talking about, but she did actually make a work directly after Bernini to an extent. So not only was she struck by the collection in the Borghese, she actually made a work which directly referred to him.
Yes, absolutely. I think she studied Baroque art in depth in general. She also studied mathematics before moving to art, and I think that's quite interesting, the way she designs herself, and also the way she was interested in seeing what Borromini did. And then she made two works that are not exhibited at the Galleria Borghese, but one is titled Baroque and another is titled Bernini. So for sure that had an impact on her practice.
Now we're going to talk about Janus Fleuri. I've heard that it's Louise Bourgeois' favourite example of her own work. I don't know if that's accurate, but I've heard it said that it was her favourite sculpture of her own. And in a way, it is among the best known of her works, and it's dramatic. Can you describe it for us?
Yes, so Janus Fleuri was made in 1968, so after her Italian trip, and it's part of a series of other 5 Januses that all have slightly different titles. And at the Galleria Borghese, we're exhibiting 4 of them. And also, it's interesting, I don't know if it's true that it was her favorite work, but also she described it as a self-portrait.
Yes.
And it features 2 phalluses joined back to back, each pointing in opposite direction. And the title also refers to a god, and it's the god of passages, of transitions. So it's this idea that you can look into the future and into the past, but those hanging sculptures rotate. So they're never fixed. They're always in flux and they metamorphose. And so I think that's what's quite interesting about it.
It hangs on a single wire, doesn't it? Because it's on that single wire, it quite easily rotates, especially when there's lots of bodies in the space, and so the flow of air means that the wire can fluctuate, and so it does move quite a lot when it's in a busy space.
Yes, exactly. So it explores multiple perspectives, the idea of binaries, male and female, conscious and unconscious, geometric and organic, and it's always in a dynamic tension. And I think that's why it's so interesting, because it talks about archaeology in a way, but also identity and existence, and psychology, which was obviously very important to her.
Absolutely, yeah. And of course, when you say those themes, immediately one thinks about the great sculptures by Bernini in the Borghese. So are you showing it close to those sculptures? How are you hanging it in the Borghese?
So Janus Fleuri is hanging next to the hermaphrodite that the Galleria Borghese still owns. So the very famous one was sold to Napoleon, so it's now at the Louvre, the one where Bernini redid the mattress. But we have another one, and so they're shown next to each other.
As you say, that it's 2 phalluses, but where they meet in the middle, it suggests a woman's genital. So this idea that you have this kind of double-edged sexuality or a doubling of gender or a non-binary body in the middle of the space is crucial to it. And so therefore that reference to the hermaphrodite is extraordinary, right?
Yes, exactly. That was exactly our idea. And that's why they're positioned next to each other.
Right. And do you think in any way, is there any record of Louise Bourgeois saying that she made this figure in direct response to those classical images of hermaphrodites?
She never really spoke about it, but I think that's something that stayed in her. She was very proud of her education. She was very proud. She went to a very good high school in Paris called Fenelon. She did an application for a job position in New York, and she just said, and then I work at the Louvre, as if it was self-explanatory. So I have the feeling that she was quite sure of her background, and obviously she was talking about art history with her husband, I guess, all the time. And so it wasn't important for her, but it was always there.
Yeah.
In the beginning, when she first moved to New York, she was quite social. She would go to openings. She would see the work of other artists. And so she knew the past, but she was looking at the present and at the future.
And that idea of transformation, it seems to me, is crucial to Louise Bourgeois' work. In every work, the ambiguity and yet the kind of specificity of the works means that we're constantly aware of this sort of transformative power. And it must be really remarkable to see her in dialogue with Bernini's very transformative scope. One thinks of Apollo and Daphne, for instance. This idea of transition and transformation being embodied in stone, and then you see Louise Bourgeois' own take on that. That must be a remarkable thing to see.
Yes, absolutely. I hope it will be a remarkable thing to see. And her work, yes, it's indeed speaks about transformation. We have a very large cell titled Passage Dangereux. Is the largest cell she ever did, which talks about the phase from when a young girl becomes a woman and sexual awakening. So somehow a psychological metamorphosis, but also physical one. And then we have another small sculpture titled Topiary, which again is somehow the metamorphosis of a young girl. But this time she's not changing because Apollo is pursuing her or because of love. She's independent. She's fully aware. She knows what she's doing. And I guess that Louise Bourgeois was also very well aware of what she was doing.
And of course, for her, gateways and doorways, and Janus being the god of gateways and doorways, is again enormously significant in her work. And she, as you pointed out, was so interested in psychology, having been through psychoanalysis and everything. So this idea of a kind of metaphorical gateway or doorway to another realm would have been really important in sculptures like the Janus.
Yes, absolutely. It's very present in the Janus, in the title of the work, and its confirmation as well. But also in other works, you can really see that. I think that the cells as well have that strength, the see-through, the idea that things are not stable and are not finalized, but life is always in flux, and you can look at things from different perspectives. And that's what she offers. She always offers another viewpoint.
One of the things about bringing together contemporary art and historic art, of course, is that there is a separation of a certain kind in the language, between a language which is informed by modernism and so on. How does it work with Bourgeois in the galleries? Does it look jarring, or is there a deeply complementary feeling between the work of Bourgeois and the work that was made several hundred years earlier?
So this is a very interesting question. I'm not sure I can ask. I guess the visitors will need to answer this question.
Right.
But I believe that you can feel there is a connection to it, a connection to art history and to different historical periods. But yes, of course, the Galleria Borghese is limited in time. And so whenever you add something, you can feel that work doesn't belong there. And so you do create something new. But I guess that's also the role of contemporary art, to keep the conversation going.
Well, Chloe, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you.
Louise Bourgeois, Unconscious Memories, is at the Galleria Borghese in Rome until the 15th of September. And that's it for this episode. You can find us on X, formerly Twitter, @TanAudio, and on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads. The Week in Art is produced by Julie Michalska, Alexander Morrison, and David Clack. And David's also the editor and sound designer. Thanks also to Daniela Hathaway and to our guests, John Paul, Tavares, and Chloe. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week for the last episode of this season. Bye for now.